Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chapter 17, our first video. It will deal with activity-based costing, often abbreviated ABC, not to be confused with ABC inventory classifications, which we have not discussed in this course. And we're going to take a look at how we use that in analysis. Okay, so here, there's 4 types of activities that cause overhead costs. Here, we're going to look how we allocate selling, general and administrative, G&A, expenses to products and assess product profitability. And procedurally, we're going to allocate overhead costs using the plant-wide overhead rate method, which we discussed previously. And that was the overhead rate that we calculated one overhead rate. But we can also calculate overhead costs using departmental rates, which can be maybe a little more accurate, but a little more complicated. And then we can take a look at how we might use activity-based costing, which is another degree of sophistication and complexity, and decide whether that's worth the extra effort to calculate it. Then we will allocate overhead costs to service companies using activity-based costing, knowing full well that we could use it in merchandising companies and manufacturing companies as well. All right, overhead cost allocation method. You'll remember we used the predetermined overhead rate in the previous chapters. So that included our materials, both direct and indirect, that went into factory overhead, and labor, direct labor and indirect labor that went into factory overhead. Not shown in this slide is the other overhead costs, such as rent and insurance and that kind of thing. So we're going to then allocate that to the goods or goods in process or work in process, as I call it. And then eventually we're going to complete those goods and move them into finished goods. And if we sell it, it'll be a cost of goods sold. If we keep it, it'll stay in finished goods inventory. Okay, let's look at the plant-wide rate. That's one rate. And frankly, that's what I've used most of my career. It's based on a volume basis, such as direct labor hours or machine hours. That's how we would allocate that predetermined overhead rate. But it is possible that we could have more than one rate, and we could do it by department. Again, it's volume-based measures like direct labor or machine hours. We might use direct labor in an assembly department, but machine hours in a group of machines that produce product. Okay. Now, activity-based costing has several rates, and we need to determine what activities drive the costs, like the number of batches of product produced. There's a number of them, which we will get to in this chapter. Okay, let's see how that works. But that doesn't change the amount of dollars in the overhead. The dollars in the overhead are the same, irrespective of what the allocation method is. All right. Now, we'll allocate overhead costs using the plant-wide overhead rate method. This is by far the most common in manufacturing companies. And the reason is it's simple and it's inexpensive to do. So the plant-wide overhead rate uses one overhead rate to allocate the overhead costs. The cost object is the unit of production, unit of product. And the allocation base is normally going to be direct labor hours, but can be machine hours. And we base it on the total budgeted overhead costs divided by that allocation base. And that allocation base can be machine hours or direct labor hours or any other logical base for allocation. That same rate is used to allocate overhead to all the products. So here's our total overhead expected cost, estimated, and then our plant-wide overhead rate. That's a predetermined overhead rate. And then we apply it to the products. And we did that in the prior 2 chapters. Okay, so here's an example. The budgeted overhead rate was $4,800,000. The budgeted direct labor hours was 100,000 hours. So we divide, and then our actual usage. Okay, now we're into actuals. We're making go-karts here. So our standard go-kart, we make 5,000 of the little beauties. They use 15 direct labor hours per unit. And the custom go-kart, we make less of them, but we use more direct labor hours per unit. So if we multiply these through, the direct labor hours actual for standard go-karts here is 75,000, and the custom go-karts is 25,000, and the total is 100,000. It's very rare, frankly, that our total actual direct labor hours will exactly equal our estimated hours. However, to make it simple, they've made it that way here in this example. So now what we do is, just like we did previously in the predetermined overhead rate, we're going to take the $4.8 million, divide it by the 100,000 direct labor hours total. That gives me $48 per direct labor hour. So now I can multiply this through. 48 times 15 tells me that there's $720 per standard go-kart and $1,200 per custom go-kart. Okay. So here again, we provided this total overhead for the year. We estimated it. Here we have our estimated plant overhead rate. We multiply it through, and now we couple that with the other product cost, which are direct materials and direct labor. So the direct materials for the standard go-kart is $400, and the direct labor is $350. And we saw from the previous slide here, the applied overhead is $720 per standard go-kart. And then the custom go-kart here has more direct materials, more direct labor, and more overhead applied. So the product cost per unit is $2,300 for this custom go-kart. Okay, now we'll try to do things a little bit more accurately. And here, what we're going to do is allocate the overhead cost using the departmental overhead rate method. Same dollars in this case in overhead cost, but we have 2 cost pools, Department Alpha and Department Bravo. So we develop a Department Alpha overhead rate and a Department Bravo overhead rate, and we apply it to the product from 2 overhead rates. So product 1 is going to get a little bit of overhead from Department Alpha, and a little bit from Department Bravo, as does Product 2, our cost objects, as we call it in the trade. Okay, so now, again, here we have $4.8 million. That did not change, but it's comprised of machining and assembly. Machining is $4,200,000 and assembly is $600,000. So now we can allocate the overhead based on direct labor hours here. So, and machine hours. So let's look at the machining department. Here we have 10 machine hours per unit for the standard go-kart and 20 machine hours per unit for the custom go-kart. So if I multiply these through, I have a total of 70,000 machine hours. Now we know from before we had 100,000 direct labor hours for the two products, standard go-kart and custom go-kart here. So now we're going to develop our overhead, departmental overhead rate. So for the machining department, we're going to use machine hours. And so we take 4.2 million, divide it by 70,000 machine hours, and that gives us $60 per machine hour. But we also have assembly, where we take $600,000 of assembly cost, which we get from here, right, and divide that by 100,000 direct labor hours for the assembly department. So we're going to apply $6 per direct labor hour that way. So if we spin that through, we're going to get $60 per machine hour. We have 100 machine hours per unit. So we're going to allocate from the machining department $600 for every standard go-kart and twice that much for the custom go-kart. Whereas with the assembly, we're going to have $90. That's $6 per direct labor hour and 15 direct labor hours. That gives us $90 from the assembly department for the standard go-kart and $25 or 25 direct labor hours, and that gives us times $6 per direct labor hour gives me $150 of overhead allocated to the assembly department. So if we add these together, the standard go-kart's going to get $690 of overhead, and the custom go-kart will get $1,350 in overhead. So if I couple that with our other product costs of direct materials and direct labor, I now have my $690 for the standard go-kart and $1,350 for the custom go-kart. Total of $2,450. Okay, so using the plant-wide method, you can see that results in substantially more for the standard go-kart and less for the custom go-kart in comparison with the departmental rate of $690 and $1,350, which is more for the custom go-kart than the standard go-kart. Okay, that looks like a good place for us to stop this video. And when we return, we'll take a look at assessing these strengths and weaknesses of these two methods. Until that time, bye for now.